Welcome to this Silicon Wafers episode, and today we're going to be talking about the gadgets ban that is being introduced in the Russian military. It's been said that Russian corruption is Ukraine's greatest ally, but it seems that the interfering bureaucratic mindset of Russian politicians and officials is also a great aid to the Ukrainian war effort. The Russian parliament adopted a law in July hiking the penalty for the unauthorized use of personal internet devices and, in fact, any internet-enabled gadgets by frontline Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. The law classifies possession of devices that allow military personnel to store or send videos, photos, or geolocated data via the internet as a grave offense, punishable by up to 15 days detention. It also forbids the transmission of any information that could be used to identify any Russian troops or their whereabouts. There are some fears that this will make it harder for Ukrainian units to analyze Russian movements, according to Ukrainian open source investigators. But even so, this law cuts both ways. On balance, it's likely that Russian soldiers will come off worse. We can guess at its negative impact by the uproar it's caused among Z-patriots and bloggers. Igor Guzenko, also known as the 13th, said in a Telegram post that the entire army relies on internet devices. But how can office rats understand and know this? Let's let these scumbags of the Duma go to war themselves, he wrote. Dva Mayora, another pro-war blogger, stated the move as showing an outdated understanding of modern frontline mobilization. They decided that a soldier should fight without thinking about his family, and the family of a mobilized person should, like the family of a soldier in World War II or the family of a Cossack, be proud that a man was mobilized. But of course, this war is brutal and isolating, and denying soldiers any connection to home and family will only intensify this. But it's the impact on operations that most concerns Russian commentators, and a potentially negative impact on combat effectiveness. In fact, Michael Naki reports on his opposition news platform how the IT community reacted to the legislation. There have never been so many posts from various channels on any other topics, and never so much swearing directed at the State Duma from soldiers anywhere, ever. As reported by the Institute for the Study of War, Russian mill bloggers widely criticized this amendment and claimed that punishing soldiers for using personal devices will significantly complicate Russian logistics and operations in general. Russian service members significantly rely on their personal devices to transmit target coordinates, to call for fire from Russian artillerymen and drone operators, to navigate frontline areas, and to coordinate between units. A prominent Russia mill blogger published a formal appeal to Turmoil and claimed that the amendment will result in the paralysis of the Russian military forces, and called on the Russian Duma Defense Committee to amend the bill to adhere more realistically with how Russian forces use personal devices in Ukraine. Several Russian mill bloggers called on the Russian government to provide secure communications and navigation devices to Russian service members before instituting punishment for the ad hoc use of personal devices, and criticized Russian Duma deputies for being out of touch with frontline realities. Russian mill bloggers also called on Duma deputies to work with the Russian armed forces on the proposed amendments and future legislation to ensure laws are in accordance with frontline realities, and urged the deputies to visit the frontline in Ukraine. One critical Russian mill blogger accused Kartopolov and his team of committing treason and pursuing this policy to help Ukraine win the war. Extreme, but indicative of the passions and outrage that this legislation has stirred. A related high-profile topic is legislation amendments which suggest that servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation can be placed under arrest without a court decision on orders directly from their commanders. It's the additions to this legislation that contain the clauses about the bans on the use of electronic technical means of communication, but the legislation is clearly linked. Adoption of this policy and its dissemination throughout the army will give unscrupulous commanders unlimited power over their subordinates, exacerbating a culture that is already brutal and arbitrary. But with this law, commanders can now arrest anyone under the pretext of them having gadgets. And there are other implications. If a military man contacts a journalist and gives him any information, he can be arrested for 10 days. Ukrainian OSINT agency Molfa, which analyzes Russian activities on the battlefield daily, reports they have observed a decrease in the data published by the Russian military on social media for some time now. At the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the situation was radically different, with many posts on social media from the Russian military who published their location and other sensitive information. Maxim Zarajevsky, head of research at Malfar, said, "The law is likely further to reduce the amount of this type of data, but the military is not the sole source of information from the battlefield. Valuable data can often be found in civilian social network profiles or even official sources like the Russian Ministry of Defense," he added. The new law also prohibits transferring information about citizens called up for military training, as well as those discharged from the army and members of their families. As Ukraine presses into Kursk, one of the strategies may be to prompt Russia into full mobilization of the educated urban population. If the new law is rigorously enforced, it will choke off information about the experiences of mobilized troops and their movements. For instance, key information about locations and how they are equipped. Among the barrage of criticism from Russian mill bloggers is the fear that such a law will place an iron curtain between the front and the rear of Russian lines. Military Commissar Alexander Simonov adds a further layer of absurdity, showing how disconnected the head is from the body in the Russian army. He also suggests using binoculars or a telescope for reconnaissance and communicating with family and friends using field mail. Well, let's see how this pans out in the era of drone warfare. Military Commissar Roman Pankov warns that no one will stop using telephones on the front line. It just creates another gap between reality and legislation, which usually ends badly. Deputy Chairman of the Moscow City Duma, Andrei Medvedev, notes that the armed forces of Ukraine, on the contrary, are saturating their units with gadgets and investing heavily in creating military applications and programs for phones. In Komsomolskaya Pravda, Alexander Kots asks, where can Russia find enough guardhouses to imprison those guilty of violating the new law? He ironically proposes sending the entire Russian army in Ukraine to a basement. It seems that everyone in Russia now knows about the basements that are used to torment their own people, as well as captured Ukrainians and those under occupation. The NTV Entertainment Channel writes that the experience of Wagner PMC shows that gadgets for fighters are not only unnecessary, but harmful. Maybe, but perhaps Wagner convicts didn't survive the front line long enough for gadgets to be of any use anyway. However, they conclude that not a single commander will take devices away from their subordinates because they are really required for effective combat. How will the law function? Questions Michael Naki. Simply, commanders will get an extra mechanism that enables them to extort money from subordinates. Moreover, it's unlikely anyone will arrest their subordinates because arrest frees them from paying those fines for 10 days. It further legitimizes the culture of abuse within the military, stuff that we've seen in videos over and over again, such as tying conscripts to trees and everything else. But now, if soldiers are taken to the basements for a shakedown and the military prosecutor's office arrives to check up on something, they can be told that the soldiers were simply under arrest for possessing gadgets or a suspicion of the same charge. In fact, the military code already prohibits soldiers from recording, sending, and sharing video messages. That's a complete violation of everything that is written in the military codes. So this legislation is just an additional layer of redundant legislation. In fact, carte blanche permission to beat, extort, and torture Russian conscripts and contract soldiers. We've also seen the numerous complaint videos by soldiers appealing above the heads of their officers to their little father Tsar. Vladimir Vladimirovich, we have no equipment, no food, and we can get no sleep, and we're being sent to certain death. Vladimir Vladimirovich, we are sure this is not what you want from us, and it's all the subordinates and bureaucrats that are to blame. And so it goes on, and so it goes on. Of course, nothing changes for the better, and the units that record these complaints to the Tsar are invariably sent to the hottest parts of the front to ensure that their voices are quickly silenced. It may also be the case that relatives are less likely to receive compensation after these videos become public. So the gadgets ban means that possibly fewer of these types of complaint videos will surface, but have any of these videos helped a single Russian soldier to survive or improve their conditions? No, absolutely not. They are all later killed in assaults, maimed, and so on. The only task set for a Russian soldier by his commanders is to die, preferably quietly and without fuss or any pitiful entreaties via video. The new law follows reports that the Russian army is experiencing record losses on the front line, with the United Kingdom's Defence Ministry estimating the casualty rate will exceed 1,000 soldiers each day over June, July, and August on a pretty regular basis. The bill is aimed at ensuring the safety of military personnel and units, says the chairman of the State Duma on Defense, Andrei Kartapolov. He told this to the Russian news agency Interfax. But as losses have mounted, so has domestic pressure from wives and mothers of military personnel for troops to return home, or at least their husbands. In May, the Kremlin declared that the leader of the movement representing soldiers' wives was a foreign agent, following a rare protest in central Moscow. So clearly, the legislation is not designed to increase military effectiveness, as it will likely have the absolutely opposite effect on frontline operations than it does to Russia's. It is being brought in to muzzle the voices of opposition to Putin's pointless and barbaric war, and will actually help the impunity and brutality that officers are meting out to their subordinates within the Russian ranks. The less people know, the better it is for the Kremlin.